Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I will be painting the Winged Tyranid Prime, which came out in the new Leviathan box set. I'm quite excited to paint this one up. I've not had to go at one of these yet, and there's so much detail to capture. So let's grab some brushes and get started. So the first thing we've done here is undercoat the model with Wraithbone spray, and we're going to be blocking in all of that purple carapace next, and for this we're going to be using Leviathan purple from the contrast range, and I'm actually going to be using a small layer brush for this application just to maintain the neatness, but if you've got a steadier hand than I have, then a small base brush would also work just as well. And we're going to be picking out all those areas that want to be purple. So obviously the main crest on the back of the model here, and all the armor, and going down towards the tail and the tail parts here as well, and then not forgetting the crest on the head and the knee pads in here as well. Now obviously depending on whether you have sort of sub-assembled the miniature for painting or not, you may find that this part is a little bit tricky and will take a bit of guidance. Now it is worth having a pot of Wraithbone on standby just in case you make any mistakes. Undoubtedly I will, but obviously once you've neatened up, that'll all be looking fine. Then also not forgetting the small crest in the middle of the chest piece here, which sort of runs down to the bottom of the chest, and then also the armor paneling on the lower hinds of the legs as well. Hopefully you can just about see that, and obviously working there. So do take your time. This will probably be one of the most time consuming parts of the miniature, so do take your time to ensure that it looks its best, and then we'll come back and we can move on to the next colour. So once you're happy and applied all that Leviathan purple, we're going to move on to the next base coat here, which will be Cadian Flesh Tone, and this is for all the wing membrane. So again, there's a reasonable amount of this to do, and I'm sticking with a sort of small layer brush just to keep the accuracy, so I don't have too much sort of tidying up to do afterwards. But really just sort of start brushing that in to where the wing membranes sit, and then let that dry. You'll probably find you'll want a second coat after that, just to really sort of block it in and get some really good smooth coverage. As obviously putting it over such a light tone like this with Wraithbone, it will be a bit patchy once it dries, as this is a layer paint as well. So just take your time, work your way around the model. Obviously there's not too much now to worry about in terms of touching other colours, but if you do happen to get anything on the purple, you can just neaten up with Leviathan purple, as this will cover it quite nicely, as it is quite a dark contrast. So once you're happy and got that Cadian Flesh Tone on the model and tidied up any other areas with the Wraithbone, we're going to move on to shading the skin and also the membrane as well. And for this we're going to be using a mix of Magos Purple and Contrast Medium, and this is a 3-part medium to 1-part Magos Purple, just to dilute that down but still keep that nice purple tone to it. And what we're going to do is just simply apply this all over the miniature, obviously minus the purple areas that are the carapace, because we naturally don't need those to be any darker from that. And for this I'm using a medium shade brush. This gets in on all the areas that we need it to do, and holds plenty of paint whilst we're applying it all over the miniature. So work your way around and then let that completely dry before moving on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that shade all over that skin, we're going to be moving on to another shade for the wing membranes now, and this is a mix of Guilliman Flesh with Contrast Medium, and this is a 2-part medium to 1-part Guilliman Flesh, just to lighten that up again, and again I'm sticking with the medium shade brush. So what we're going to be doing is just working this all over those wings, just to help pick out the definition between them and letting that do. So we don't want any heavy pooling or anything like that, but just very delicately work that between the wings and the spines to get that on there. So obviously not forgetting to do inside and out. And then sticking with that Guilliman flesh, we're going to be moving on to the little bits of skin between the wing arms here. And for this we're going to be using the same mix as before and just coating that over the top of the shade that we have already done with the Magos purple. And this just sort of gives it a slightly different flesh look to the rest of the miniature, as we do want this area to sort of be a little bit more prominent and different to the rest. So just very carefully coat that over. If you do happen to touch the skin, you can just either wet your brush and wipe it away. That would be quite straightforward, or if you've got sort of small finger, you can get that, pop that in there and just wipe it off. Next up we are going to be looking at some of the more exposed flesh areas, and for this we're going to be doing a mix of Volupus Pink with Contrast Medium, and this is a 1-to-1 mix, as we still want that to be sort of nice and strong, but just have a little bit extra sort of flow improvement from the medium. And what we're going to be doing is using a small layer brush or a fine tip brush of your choosing, and we're going to be picking out sort of any exposed areas and the vents in the skin. So for example, this area here. Now you do want a nice steady hand with this and try very hard not to get it onto the rest of the skin, but again, if you do make any mistakes, just wipe your brush off as fast as possible and just apply a little bit of water in that area. You may find you'll have to redo the vent, as the water may just go into that recess, but it will allow you to sort of keep the skin as clean as possible, so that you don't have to find yourself redoing a lot of work that you don't want to be doing. But sort of work your way around and pick out any of these areas that you find to be sort of more exposed. So I tend to find the areas sort of cracks in the skin, so where the joints are, for instance, there, and there's some around the legs and the feet as well, and obviously these sort of vents in the skin here as well. They will just help break up the paleness of the skin and give the model a little bit more depth. But so take your time, work your way around, and then let that completely dry. Next we're going to be using Flesh Tearers Red to pick out all of the claws, talons and the feet of the miniature. Now on this particular one there's quite a bit of that. You've got obviously the main talons at the front here of the model, obviously these little claws on the same arm, and then the little sort of spikes on the bottom, as well as all these sort of spikes and talons at the end of the wings, and then obviously not forgetting the main feet themselves. So there's quite a bit to do. Obviously the neater you are, the less sort of tidying up you'll need to do, and hopefully this is quite an easy paint to control, and I'm using a small layer brush to do so. But sort of carefully work your way around the model and sort of pick out all of those red details, and then let that completely dry before moving on to the next stage. Next up we're just going to use a little bit of Skeleton Horde just to pick out the teeth in the model. So we're just going to run this just over the top of those teeth just to help those stand out a little bit more. Next up we're going to be putting some highlights onto the model, and first of all we're going to be using Pallid Witch Flesh, and this is just to pick out some of the raised and most prominent edges of the white skin. So particularly if you were looking at the arms here, you could pick out the parts that go into the red, that sort of stand out and a bit more higher than the rest of the skin. But really you're just sort of looking to pick out sort of any edges or sort of raised muscle area, keeping the sort of pink shade in the recesses, showing that off nicely. But obviously work your way around. Obviously you can add as much or as little of this as you wish, depending on what sort of finish you're looking for. If you're looking for quite a sort of a dirty skin, then you could very much leave it as it is. But if you are looking for a bit more of a crisper, cleaner finish, then you can by all means pick out as much more detail as you wish. Once you're happy with that skin, we're going to be moving on to a small edge highlight now for the wings, and for this we're going to be using a little bit of Kislev flesh. And what we're going to be doing is just picking out the very tops and raised edges of those wings as they go out, and this is just simply just to pick out those raised parts, just to give those a bit more of a crisp finish as we work around. So you want a nice sort of fine brush for this. As before, I was using the sort of small layer brush, and this sort of gives a nice sort of crisp line for highlighting as well. You could also, if you wanted to, pick out any sort of raised edges on the wings themselves, so sort of down the edges here, but it depends sort of how much you want to add in as you go round. As I say, the shading does a lot of that for us. As we've been round, it sort of likes to sort of prominates the areas that we want in the light, but this sort of top part here just sort of helps capture those edges quite nicely. So work your way across both the wings, and then we can move on to the next highlight. Next up, we're going to start looking at highlighting up that purple, and the first colour we're going to be coming into here is Xeros Purple, and we're going to be looking at starting off a sort of feathering technique over the carapace and also all the other armoured areas. So for this, we're just going to be drawing some sort of nice sort of thin lines over the armour to just sort of start off that feathering technique. Now these can be quite bold lines because this is the first highlight we're going to put on, and it's also the sort of closest match to the Leviathan Purple base coat, but offers a slight highlight from what that has there. So you can make these sort of slightly thicker, but when we get onto the next ones we will be sort of thinning those lines down slightly. But nevertheless, take your time to work your way around all of those areas, and then we can move on to the next colour. Once you're happy with that Xeros Purple, we're going to move on to the second highlight now, and that is Genestealer Purple. And we're going in basically with exactly the same technique as we did before, and ideals, but except this time we are going to make the lines a lot thinner, as this will be a bit more of a sort of edge highlight approach. So really just sort of looking to take as careful an approach as you can to the model and just sort of draw those lines over this. Now this might take some sort of considerable time to do. Obviously the larger the model with the purple, the longer this takes, but it really is worth the time and the steady hand to get this right. You do want to have a sort of small brush for this approach. As I say, I'm using a small layer brush, but occasionally, depending on the model I'm working on, I will use either a 00 or 000 Artist Opus brush, but you use whatever you're sort of most comfortable with and what you have available at the time. So once you're happy with this colour, we'll move on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that Genestealer Purple, we're going to move on to the last highlight now for the purple, and that is Slanesh Grey. And this is just for the edges and sort of highest ridges of the model. Particularly looking at the head crest here, we will be picking out the sort of sharp edges of the tops of the crest. And again, you want to stick with a sort of small brush to be able to pick these lines out, and then you'll be able to get nice, clean, crisp finishes. But work your way around the model and pick these out. Obviously, then not forgetting the edges of the tops of the spine here, and then also the sort of crown nose, if you like, here as well, to get a nice crisp finish. Once you're happy with that purple, we're going to be moving on to highlighting up the red next, and for this we're going to be starting off with Evil Sun Scarlet, and we're going to be picking out sort of all the sort of raised edges of the claws and talons around the model. So particularly on the front talon here, we're just going to be picking out this edge of the claw and sort of running our brush down. This can be quite a chunky highlight to obviously go over the Flesh Terrors red that we've done before, so don't worry if you find this comes out a little bit thicker than normal. And obviously looking to pick out the sort of lines here where it's a bit more gradual, and you could do a sort of feathering technique on there if you want to, or just a standard sort of edge highlight style. So work your way around sort of all the claws and the talons on the model, and then once you're happy we can move on to the next colour. Next up for the red highlights, we're going to be moving on to Wild Rider Red, and again we're just looking at doing an edge highlight here, but keeping it a little bit more thinner and towards sort of the sharpest edges of the model. So just sort of not, instead of going all the way up the claws like we were before, just sort of going up sort of halfway, and then sort of picking out any of the sort of sharper points around the edges of the model. So be a little bit more refined with this one as you go around. The final highlight we're going to be putting on the red now is a very spot highlight of Troll Slayer Orange, and this is just for the very sort of tips of the sharp of the claws as we look at them and work our way down. So this be used quite sparingly because it is quite a strong contrast to the rest of the red, but really helps make them pop in small doses. So just very tips as you're looking at the claws and the talons around the model. With that red all now complete, the final touch to give to this model now is the yellow glow in the eyes, and for this we're going to be looking at iodine yellow from the contrast paint range, and we're just going to simply take this straight from the pot and very finely drop that into the socket for the eyes, and then also just a little bit around there as well, just to give that nice yellow glow that is quite typical for the aliens. And there we have the finished Winged Tyranid Prime, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. I certainly have enjoyed painting this model up, lots of detail to capture. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. If not, I will see you in the next one. Thank you.